The tracks ran straight as a rifle barrel through the Mississippi bottomlands, twin ribbons of iron laid across a swamp that had swallowed men whole for 1,000 years. On the morning of October 14, 1879, a section foreman named Cyrus Blackman walked those tracks with a handcar and a lantern, heading north from the small depot at Vicksburg Landing. He carried a schedule book, a Springfield musket from the war that had ended 14 years earlier, and a tin cup for coffee. His wife watched him go from the door of their company cabin, the same way she had watched him leave every morning for the 214 days since they'd arrived in this fever-haunted stretch of Mississippi. She would never see him again. What happened to Cyrus Blackman remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Reconstruction-era South, a story buried not in a grave but in the silence of archives, the careful omissions of railway ledgers, and the strange refusal of the railroad company to acknowledge that he had ever existed. The discovery that unraveled this forgotten tragedy came not in the swamp but in a courthouse basement in 1973, when a flood forced the removal of records from the Yazoo County Courthouse. Among the waterlogged files, a county clerk found a leather-bound journal belonging to a doctor who had served the railroad in the 1870s. Inside, pressed between pages describing the treatment of yellow fever and the amputation of a laborer's crushed leg, was a single, chilling notation. October 19, 1879, requested to attend tracks at mile marker 42. Found the body of a white male, approximately 40 years of age, head crushed by heavy object. Clothing identified as railway issue. No identification papers present. Company representative instructed that no official record be made. Burial at the crossroads, per company directive *. The doctor, whose name was Samuel Tate, had underlined the words "no official record" twice. This is the story of a man who vanished from history, of the railway that erased him, and of the truth that was finally exhumed from the archives a century later. It is a story of the forgotten dead of the Reconstruction South, the men who built the iron arteries of a nation and were discarded when they became inconvenient. And it is a story that ends not with justice, but with a single haunting question that still cannot be answered. The Mississippi Central Railroad had been a dream before the war, a fragile thread of iron connecting the cotton fields of the Delta to the port of Vicksburg. During the war, it had been a lifeline for the Confederacy, transporting troops and supplies until Union General Ulysses S. Grant's relentless campaign severed the line in 1863. Sherman himself had ordered the tracks torn up and the iron heated over fires and twisted into what soldiers called Sherman's neckties. For 2 years, the railroad lay broken, its bridges burned, its ties rotting in the swamp. After the war, the railway became a symbol of the New South. Northern investors, flush with the profits of war industries, poured money into rebuilding, seeing an opportunity to control the movement of cotton, timber, and labor. By 1870, the Mississippi Central had been resurrected, its tracks extending from Vicksburg north through the swamp and into the rolling hills beyond. The work was done by a desperate army of men, freedmen who had nowhere else to go, Irish immigrants fleeing the famine, and poor white farmers whose land had been taken for taxes. Cyrus Blackman was one of the latter. Born in 1839 in the hill country of Tennessee, he had fought for the Confederacy at Shiloh and Chickamauga, surviving wounds that left him with a limp and a permanent tremor in his right hand. After the war, he found his farm had been seized for unpaid taxes, his wife dead of a fever that swept through the countryside in 1866. He drifted south, working as a laborer, a fisherman, and finally a section hand for the railroad, laying track through the swamp. He was a quiet man, according to the few records that survive. He kept to himself, read his Bible by lantern light, and was known among the other hands as someone who could be trusted with money or secrets. The section foreman who walked the tracks was a position of modest authority but immense danger. Each morning, Blackman and his crew of 6 men would take a handcar out along the line, inspecting the rails for warping, the ties for rot, and the bridges for structural failure. It was monotonous work, but it required a sharp eye. A single misplaced spike could derail a train, killing dozens and costing the company thousands of dollars. The foreman bore the ultimate responsibility. If the track failed, he was dismissed. If the company lost money, he was blamed. If he complained about conditions, he was replaced. Blackman had been foreman for 7 months when he disappeared. The morning of October 14, he had reported to the company depot at Vicksburg Landing, signed his name in the logbook, and collected his daily rations. He had complained to the dispatcher about a section of track near mile marker 42 that had been settling into the swamp mud, requiring daily attention. The dispatcher noted the complaint but offered no solution. Blackman took his crew south along the line, and that was the last time anyone officially saw him alive. When the handcar returned that evening, Blackman was not on it. The crew reported that they had stopped at mile marker 42 to examine the subsidence, and Blackman had walked ahead to check a culvert. He had never returned. They had called for him, searched the adjacent woods, and finally returned to report him missing. The company dispatched a search party the next morning, but it found nothing. No body, no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away from the line. A week later, Dr. Samuel Tate, the railway's contract physician, was summoned to mile marker 42. He arrived to find a scene that defied explanation. Blackman's body lay at the edge of the swamp, partially submerged in water, his head crushed beyond recognition. The doctor's journal entry described the wound as consistent with a heavy object, such as a sledgehammer or iron rail. The body had been stripped of its identification. Blackman's watch, a silver pocket watch his wife had given him on their wedding day, was missing. His boots, which were distinctive for the extra sole the company had issued to him to accommodate his limp, were gone. The doctor's journal recorded his confusion. The body had clearly been moved, he wrote. The position of the limbs, the bruising on the shoulders, all indicate that he was dragged to this location. The wound to the head was inflicted elsewhere, likely some distance away. But the doctor's most unsettling observation came later. The men who accompanied me from the company were not searching for evidence. They were searching for something that had been placed in the vicinity. I do not know what it was. The company's representative, a man whose name the doctor did not record, instructed that no death certificate be filed. Blackman's wife was told that her husband had been found dead of a heart attack and had been buried at the company's expense. She was given $50 and a train ticket to leave the area within 3 days. She took the money, but she did not leave. Instead, she began asking questions that the railroad did not want asked. A railroad is more than iron and timber. It is a mechanism of power, connecting cities but also controlling the flow of goods, people, and information. In the Reconstruction South, the railroad was the arm of federal authority, a reminder that the Union had won the war and intended to exploit the peace. The Southern railroads were owned largely by Northern capitalists, men who had never set foot in Mississippi but who dictated the terms of labor, punishment, and profit from offices in New York and Boston. The men who ran the railroads on the ground were equally ruthless, a breed of executives who viewed labor as a commodity to be used and discarded. The Mississippi Central was no exception. By 1879, the company was in financial trouble. The railroad bubble that had inflated during Reconstruction had begun to burst, and the company's investors were demanding results. The line was hemorrhaging money, and the company's president, a Philadelphia financier named Henry Wade, had ordered cost-cutting measures that pushed the line's workers to the breaking point. Wages had been cut, maintenance deferred, and workers threatened with dismissal if they complained. The section foremen, like Blackman, were the front line of this pressure, expected to do more with less and keep the line running at any cost. The swamp through which the tracks ran was a hostile environment, a miasma of disease, snakes, and shifting ground. The soil was unstable, a deep layer of organic muck that could swallow a railcar. To build the line, the workers had driven thousands of wooden pilings into the swamp, creating a foundation for the tracks that was precarious at best. The pilings rotted, the ground shifted, and sections of track would sink by inches, requiring constant shoring up. Blackman had been complaining about the subsidence at mile marker 42 for weeks, but the company refused to allocate the resources to fix it properly. Instead, they demanded daily inspection and temporary repair, knowing full well that the section would fail eventually. 2 weeks after Blackman's disappearance, a second section foreman, a man named Elias Guthrie, was found dead under similar circumstances. Guthrie had also been inspecting the line near mile marker 42, and his body was discovered with a crushed skull. He had been stripped of his identification and his possessions. The company again refused to file a death certificate, offering a similar story of heart attack and careless burial. But rumors began to spread among the section hands, rumors that the company was not only failing to investigate the deaths but was actively covering them up. The rumors found a voice in a Vicksburg newspaper, the Daily Commercial, which published a brief but pointed article in November 1879. The article, titled Mysterious Deaths on the Mississippi Central, described the two deaths and noted the company's refusal to cooperate with the local coroner. It quoted an anonymous section hand who claimed that the deaths were no accident, that the railroad had hired men to eliminate foremen who complained too loudly. The article was largely ignored, buried under national news of political corruption and labor unrest. But it opened a door that the railroad could not close. A grand jury was convened in Yazoo County to investigate the deaths, spurred by the newspaper article and complaints from the families. The jury subpoenaed railroad officials, including the local superintendent and the company doctor. Dr. Tate, who had been ordered by his superiors to remain silent, testified reluctantly about what he had seen. He described the crushed skulls, the missing possessions, and the company's directive to file no records. He admitted that he believed the deaths were not accidental, that they were the result of deliberate violence. The railroad officials presented a different story. They testified that Blackman and Guthrie had been killed by unknown parties, likely freedmen who harbored resentment toward the railroad for its labor policies. They cited no evidence for this claim, but it fit the racial narrative that many white Mississippians wanted to believe. The grand jury, which was composed entirely of white men, many of whom had ties to the railroad, declined to issue an indictment. The case was closed. But the families of the dead men did not accept the verdict. Cyrus Blackman's wife, whose first name has been lost to history, continued her investigation, gathering testimony from section hands who had worked with her husband. She discovered that both Blackman and Guthrie had been vocal critics of the company's cost-cutting measures, that they had threatened to report the unsafe conditions to the federal authorities, who had regulatory oversight over the railroads. She believed, though she could not prove, that the company had silenced them. The investigation that truly unraveled the mystery did not begin until a century later, in 1973, when the Yazoo County courthouse flooded and the archives were moved. The leather-bound journal of Dr. Samuel Tate, discovered in a box of water-damaged records, opened a window onto a conspiracy that had been hidden for generations. The journal contained not only the chilling notation of Blackman's death but also a series of entries that revealed a pattern of violence on the Mississippi Central. The doctor had recorded similar cases, at least 8 over the course of his employment with the railroad, all involving men who had been killed under mysterious circumstances, all on the same stretch of line between Vicksburg and the town of DeSoto. He noted that the company had established a policy of not filing death certificates for any accident that occurred on the line, that the men were simply removed from the roster and replaced. The doctor, who had served as a battlefield surgeon during the war, was no stranger to death, but even he was disturbed by the cold efficiency of the process. The journal also contained a map, drawn by the doctor in pencil on the inside cover, showing the locations of the deaths. The sites formed a rough line, a string of graves marked not by headstones but by the doctor's careful notation. The map revealed that mile marker 42 was not an isolated tragedy but the focal point of a pattern of murder, a killing field that had been deliberately concealed by the railroad. The map, along with the journal, was brought to the attention of a young historian at the University of Mississippi, a graduate student named Eleanor Parrish, who was researching the history of railroad labor in the Reconstruction South. Parrish had spent 2 years combing through company records, newspaper archives, and family histories, trying to piece together the lives of the men who had built the Southern railroads. The discovery of the journal was a breakthrough, a key that unlocked a hidden history of violence and exploitation. Parrish's investigation took her to the archives of the Mississippi Central, which had been purchased by the Illinois Central Railroad in 1882 and were stored in a warehouse in Chicago. She found that the company's records from the 1870s were remarkably incomplete. Personnel files for the section hands had been systematically destroyed, and the official accident reports, which should have been filed with the state, were nowhere to be found. The company had, in effect, erased the men who had died on the line, eliminating any evidence of the violence that had been done to them. Parrish also found a series of letters between the company's local superintendent and its president that hinted at the reasons for the cover-up. The letters, written in 1879 and 1880, discussed the problem of disgruntled employees who had threatened to report the company's unsafe practices to the federal authorities. The superintendent suggested a solution: it is best to deal with such matters internally, as it avoids the complications of legal proceedings and the attention of the press. The president responded with a cryptic instruction: proceed as you see fit, but ensure no trail leads back to the company. The implication was clear: the company had systematically murdered employees who threatened to expose its cost-cutting measures, eliminating them as a threat to its profits. The killings were not the work of random violence but a calculated policy of intimidation and murder. The second major discovery came in 1982, when a utility crew digging a trench near mile marker 42 unearthed a mass grave containing the skeletal remains of 12 men. The bodies had been buried in a shallow pit, their skulls crushed, their possessions stripped. Among the remains, archaeologists found a silver pocket watch, its face shattered, its inscription still legible: "To Cyrus, with love, June 1863." It was Blackman's watch, the one his wife had given him on their wedding day, the one the railroad had claimed was missing. The grave also contained the remains of Elias Guthrie, identified by a distinctive belt buckle that his wife had described to investigators in 1879. The mass grave was, in fact, the final resting place of all the men the railroad had killed, a hidden cemetery at the edge of the swamp, a monument to the company's greed and violence. The discovery of the grave prompted a new investigation by the Yazoo County authorities, who interviewed surviving members of the families, gathered testimony from former railroad workers, and examined the documents Parrish had unearthed. The investigation confirmed the pattern of violence, the company's systematic destruction of evidence, and the collusion of local officials who had accepted bribes to look the other way. But the investigation also revealed something more disturbing: the men who had carried out the killings were not ordinary railroad employees but hired killers, men recruited from the criminal underworld of the Mississippi Delta. They were known as company men, enforcers who traveled the line, eliminating workers who would become a liability. Their identities were a closely guarded secret, protected by the company's network of corrupt officials. The investigation, however, could not bring justice. The men who had ordered the murders were long dead, their names lost to history. The company that had authorized the killings no longer existed, having been absorbed into a larger corporation that disclaimed any responsibility for the actions of its predecessor. The families of the victims were offered a token settlement, a sum that was barely enough to cover the cost of reburying the remains. The final truth, the emotional revelation that lies at the heart of this story, is not about the murders themselves but about the system that made them possible. The Reconstruction South was a place of profound inequality, a society where the lives of working men were cheap, where the profits of capital were paramount, and where the law was an instrument of the powerful. The railroad was the embodiment of that system, a mechanism of exploitation that used and discarded men with casual indifference. Cyrus Blackman was not the first man to die on the Mississippi Central, and he was not the last. The pattern of violence extended for decades, from the end of the Civil War to the early years of the 20th century, when the labor movement finally forced the railroads to improve working conditions. But the men who died in the swamp were not remembered, their names erased from the records, their stories silenced. They were the invisible dead, the forgotten victims of a system that valued profit above all else. The story of Cyrus Blackman is also a story of class, a narrative of the exploitation of labor that transcends the racial and regional boundaries of the Reconstruction South. The section hands who walked the tracks, who laid the iron and repaired the bridges, were not just the victims of a murderous company but the casualties of an economic system that treated human beings as commodities. The railroad was the engine of that system, the mechanism by which the new capitalist order imposed its will on the land and its people. In the end, the question that remains unanswered is not who killed Cyrus Blackman, but why his death was allowed to be forgotten. The answer lies in the nature of the archives themselves, the carefully curated documents of the powerful, the systematic erasure of the voiceless from the historical record. The railroad did not just commit murder, it committed a crime against memory, a crime that robbed the dead of their names and their stories, a crime that continues to shape our understanding of the past. On a cool October morning in 1974, Eleanor Parrish stood at mile marker 42, the site of the mass grave, looking out over the swamp. The tracks were still there, the same iron rails that Blackman had walked, now worn by 100 years of traffic. The swamp had reclaimed much of the land, the pilings rotting, the ties sinking into the mud. The section house where Blackman had lived was gone, torn down decades ago, its site marked only by a patch of weeds. Parrish had come to pay her respects, to honor the memory of the men who had died in the swamp, the men whose stories she had spent years recovering. She carried a copy of the doctor's journal, its pages brittle with age, its map marking the graves of the forgotten. She read the notation once more, October 19, 1879, requested to attend tracks at mile marker 42. Found the body of a white male, approximately 40 years of age, head crushed by heavy object, she thought of Cyrus Blackman, the man who had walked the tracks, who had complained about the unsafe conditions, who had threatened to expose the company's greed. She thought of the men who had killed him, the company enforcers who had crushed his skull and stripped his body and thrown him into a shallow grave. She thought of the wife who had tried to find justice, the officials who had looked the other way, the company that had erased his name from history. The story, she knew, was not just about the past. It was about the present, about the ongoing struggle to recover the voices of the silenced, to bring the stories of the forgotten to light. The archives were not neutral, she understood, they were the product of power, a selective record of the deeds of the rich and the powerful. To recover the history of the poor, the marginalized, the voiceless required a different kind of work, a labor of recovery that went against the grain of the official record. Parrish's research, which she eventually published as a monograph, did not bring justice to the dead. But it gave them something more important, a place in history, a recognition that they had existed, that they had struggled, that they had died. The story of Cyrus Blackman, the section foreman who walked the tracks of the Mississippi Central, was no longer forgotten. It was now a part of the historical record, a testament to the violence of the Reconstruction South and the enduring power of memory. And yet, even as Parrish closed her book and walked away from the swamp, she knew that there was still one question that could not be answered. The doctor's journal had noted that the company representative who had instructed him to file no report had seemed to be searching for something near the body. What was it? What had been placed near mile marker 42, or hidden there, that the company was so desperate to recover? The answer, if it exists, lies in the same swamp that swallowed Cyrus Blackman and his crew, the same depths that have concealed the secret for more than a century. Somewhere beneath the mud and the water, in a place that has never been excavated, there may be a clue to the final mystery, a piece of evidence that explains not just the murder but the reason for it, not just the violence but the secret that justified it. What was the company so desperate to hide? What lay at the bottom of that swamp that was worth the lives of 12 men? The question lingers, unanswered, a haunting reminder of the secrets that history holds, the truths that still lie buried beneath the earth. And in the silence of the archives, in the darkness of the swamp, the story of Cyrus Blackman continues to wait, waiting for the one who will finally uncover the truth.